Daniel Matthew once believed he had been born for something beautiful. In his childhood, when other children were busy dreaming about being superheroes or movie stars, Daniel had only one dream: to become a storyteller. He would sit by the window in his family's small house, scribbling in worn-out notebooks, weaving tales of love, courage, and faith. His parents, Jonathan and Ruth, were simple, God-fearing people. His mother played the piano at church. His father was a high school teacher who always encouraged Daniel to follow his heart. Their home was not rich in money, but it was rich in warmth, kindness, and love. Every evening, they sat together for dinner, prayed before eating, and talked about their day. Weekends were filled with laughter, music, and stories read aloud by the fireplace. Daniel often felt like he lived in a little piece of heaven on earth. His parents taught him the value of honesty, hard work, and above all, the importance of trusting in God even when life didn't make sense. In school, Daniel was quiet but observant. He never sought the spotlight, but when he wrote, teachers took notice. His essays won awards, his poems were published in small journals, and his heart found meaning in every word he wrote. By the time he turned 22, Daniel had earned a degree in literature and had landed a job as a junior editor at a publishing house. Life seemed to be unfolding just as he had imagined. He was also in love. Grace was a bright, cheerful young woman with a love for books and a laugh that made people turn around. They met at a local book club and became inseparable. While Daniel was reserved and introspective, Grace was vibrant and fearless. Together, they balanced each other. They dreamed of getting married, moving to a small house near the mountains, and building a life full of creativity and love. Daniel's life was perfect. He had a supportive family, a woman who loved him, and a job that connected him to his passion. Most of all, he had faith, a strong, rooted faith in God, in goodness, and in the belief that things happen for a reason. He never missed Sunday church, and he often volunteered with youth groups to help young writers find their voice. But life has a way of testing even the strongest faith. And Daniel's test came unexpectedly, brutal and merciless. It was a rainy Friday evening when everything changed. Daniel was at work when he got the call. His parents had been driving back from a countryside retreat when a truck driver, speeding and drunk, lost control of his vehicle and crashed into their car. The officer on the line was trying to be gentle, but the words hit Daniel like a hammer. "They didn't make it, son. I'm so sorry." Time seemed to stop. The noise of the office faded. The papers in his hand dropped to the floor. He felt his knees buckle, his stomach churn, and his heart split wide open. He didn't cry. He couldn't. It felt unreal, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. That night, Grace held him as he sat in silence, staring at the wall. He didn't speak, didn't eat, couldn't sleep. He just kept hearing those words echo in his mind. They didn't make it. The days that followed were a blur. The funeral, the condolences, the empty house he had to clean out. It all moved like scenes from someone else's life. He looked at old photo albums and wondered how the warmth in those pictures could feel so cold now. Their laughter haunted the walls. Their presence lingered in every room. But they were gone. He tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. The God he had once trusted felt distant, silent, even cruel. How could a loving God take both of his parents in one blow? How could he let them suffer while letting the drunk driver survive with only a few scratches? The anger grew slowly, and with it, a dark emptiness. Grace stayed by his side for months, trying to lift him from the pit he was falling into. But Daniel was slipping, bit by bit. He stopped going to work. He stopped writing. He wouldn't pick up calls from friends. He would sit for hours in darkness, a bottle of whiskey his only companion. He told himself it was just for the pain, just to sleep, just until things got better. But things didn't get better. They got worse. Alcohol became more than a crutch. It became his identity. Morning started with it. Evening ended with it. The man who once spoke softly and kindly now shouted in anger, cursed at the world, and locked himself away. Grace begged him to get help. She cried. She prayed. She held him through his nightmares. But eventually, her strength ran out. She left one morning with a note on the table. "I love you, Daniel, but I can't watch you destroy yourself." Losing her was the final blow. Daniel no longer cared about anything. His job was long gone. His apartment was a mess. Dishes piled up, laundry left undone, the air heavy with regret. He avoided the mirror because he couldn't face the man he had become. His notebooks, once filled with stories and dreams, were now covered in dust. He felt like a failure, as a son, as a partner, as a human being. But the worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the emptiness, the complete absence of meaning. He didn't just feel lost. He felt invisible, forgotten, as if life had moved on and left him behind. He would walk through the streets at night, not to go anywhere, but just to feel the wind, to remind himself he was still alive. Sometimes he would stare at the stars and whisper into the darkness, "Are you even there?" But there was never an answer. The heavens were silent. The God he had once prayed to felt like a myth. He often thought about ending it all. Maybe that would be easier, for everyone, including himself. But even that required strength he didn't have. Years passed in this hollow state. People forgot about him. The publishing world moved on. Grace got married to someone else. His old friends stopped trying. And Daniel? He survived. Barely. Each day was just about getting through the next hour, the next drink, the next breath. There was no light in his life, no music, no prayer. Until one rainy night, 3 years to the day his parents died, something happened. Something small. Something strange. Something that would eventually change everything. But Daniel didn't know that yet. That night, he was just a broken man walking through a storm, unaware that Grace was about to find him again, not through a woman, or a drink, or even his own strength, but through the one he had forgotten, the one who had never forgotten him. 3 years had passed since the accident that took Daniel's parents away. 3 years of trying to numb the ache in his chest, of trying to survive days that felt endless and meaningless. In that time, Daniel had changed so much that even he wouldn't have recognized the man he had become. The once hopeful, gentle soul had become quiet and withdrawn. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken. His apartment was always dark, the windows covered by heavy curtains that shut out the sun and the world. Dishes piled up in the sink. The air smelled of mildew and old alcohol. Daniel rarely showered, rarely ate more than a few slices of bread or instant noodles, and never spoke to anyone unless he had to. There was no one left to call him, no one who waited for him. The world had moved on, and he had let it. And that was okay with him. At least, that's what he told himself. But inside, he was screaming. His mind was like a war zone, filled with memories of better times that only made the present worse. He would lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, remembering his mother's voice as she hummed in the kitchen, or his father's laughter during a family game night. Those memories were sharp knives now, beautiful but painful. Sometimes he wished he could erase them altogether just to stop hurting. On one particular night, the pain became too loud to ignore. The city was blanketed in rain. The kind of heavy, cold rain that seemed to drown the world in gray. Daniel sat by his window, a bottle of cheap vodka in one hand, the other holding an old photograph of his family. It was the last photo they had taken together, his parents standing on either side of him, all three smiling at a church picnic. His fingers trembled. He stared at their faces, and something inside him snapped. He couldn't do this anymore. He got up, grabbed his coat, and left his apartment. He had no umbrella, no plan, just the haunting feeling that he had reached the end. Rain soaked through his clothes in minutes, but he kept walking. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional car whooshing past. He wandered without purpose, without thought, only with pain. His steps took him toward the river, a place he had visited before when thoughts like these had clouded his mind. But tonight, something felt final. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry. He was just tired. So tired. The bridge stood tall over the roaring river below. The water, angry from the storm, crashed against the stone supports like fists pounding a wall. Daniel walked to the edge, gripped the cold metal railing, and looked down. The current was fast. The fall would be hard, but it would be over quickly, and maybe, just maybe, he would finally find peace. He whispered into the wind, "I'm sorry. I tried." He closed his eyes. But just as he was about to lean forward, a sudden, blinding flash of lightning split the sky. The crack of thunder that followed shook the air, loud enough to feel in his bones. Startled, Daniel opened his eyes, and something caught his attention. Far in the distance, barely visible through the sheets of rain, was a small light. A soft, golden glow coming from between buildings. It was faint, like a candle struggling to stay lit in the storm. For a moment, Daniel forgot about the river. The light pulled at him, Something about it felt familiar. Not in the physical sense, but in the way a forgotten song can tug at the heart. He turned away from the railing and began to walk toward it, unsure why. His steps were slow, heavy. Every part of him was soaked, his shoes squishing with each move, his hands numb from the cold. But still, he moved forward. As he got closer, the light grew clearer. It came from an old stone building nestled between two taller ones. The walls were covered in ivy, the roof slanted with age, and in front hung a wooden sign swaying gently in the wind. St. Peter's Chapel. Daniel had passed this church before, years ago, back when he still believed. It had always looked small and humble, like something from another century. He had never been inside. He had never needed to. But tonight, he did. He walked up the steps, each one slippery from the rain. His hand hesitated at the large wooden door. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar. Maybe hope, maybe longing, maybe just desperation. He pushed the door open. It creaked as it moved, the sound echoing in the quiet space inside. The church was warm, lit by dozens of candles. The wooden pews were mostly empty, except for a few scattered prayer books and cushions. The air smelled of wax, old wood, and something comforting, like time had slowed inside these walls. Daniel stepped inside, dripping wet. He stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. Then a voice called out gently from the side. "Welcome. You're safe here." Daniel turned to see an elderly man walking toward him. He had white hair, a lined face, and eyes that carried peace. He wore a simple sweater and held a mug of tea in his hand. "I'm Joseph," the man said. "I take care of this place." Daniel said nothing. He was cold, wet, broken. He didn't know how to respond to kindness anymore. Joseph didn't push. He simply walked up to him, took off his scarf, and wrapped it around Daniel's neck. Then he guided him to a bench near a small fireplace in the corner. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Sit," Joseph said. "Warm yourself." Daniel obeyed. He hadn't realized how cold he was until the warmth began to return to his hands. They sat in silence for a while. Joseph didn't ask questions. He didn't preach. He just let Daniel be. Eventually, Daniel broke the silence. I was at the bridge," he said quietly, his voice raw. Joseph nodded slowly. "I figured. I've seen that look before." Daniel looked at him, surprised. Joseph smiled gently. "I was once where you are. Lost. Angry. Tired of life. And then, someone found me." Daniel looked at the crucifix above the altar. "God." Joseph nodded. "Yes, but not in the way people usually think. Not with thunder or miracles. Just presence. Stillness. A whisper in the storm." Daniel laughed bitterly. "I used to believe in him. Not anymore." Joseph handed him a small Bible. It was worn and soft from use. "Take this. You don't have to read it all. Just one part. The end of the Gospels. The crucifixion. You might find something there." Daniel hesitated, then took it, not out of belief, but out of exhaustion. That night, Joseph gave him a dry blanket and let him sleep on one of the pews. The church was quiet, the storm still raging outside. But inside, for the first time in years, Daniel felt safe. The storm outside raged into the night, pounding against the stained glass windows of St. Peter's Chapel. Thunder cracked like a drum roll from heaven, yet inside the little church, peace hung in the air like incense. Daniel lay curled on a long wooden pew, a thick wool blanket wrapped around him, his head resting on his rolled-up jacket. The fire in the corner flickered low, casting shadows across the wooden floor like dancing spirits. Sleep came slowly. His mind was heavy with exhaustion, but also strangely alert. For the first time in years, he wasn't passed out from alcohol. He was sober, and that scared him. Sobriety meant he had to feel. And the feelings, like floodwaters, came crashing in: sorrow, guilt, regret, confusion. But also something else. Something small. A flicker of stillness in his chest. Not comfort, not peace, but maybe the memory of it. He awoke early, even before the sun began to rise. His body was stiff, sore from the hard wooden bench, but he didn't complain. It had been the warmest sleep he'd had in months. Joseph was already up, humming an old hymn as he poured hot water into a chipped teapot in the small church kitchen. "Morning," Joseph said gently when he noticed Daniel stirring. "You slept like someone carrying years of pain." "I was," Daniel replied honestly. "Still am." Joseph didn't press him. He brought over a cup of hot tea and sat beside him in silence. After a few sips, Daniel asked quietly, "Why are you here? I mean this church. It's so small, so forgotten." Joseph looked out toward the altar and smiled. "Because I was once forgotten too." Daniel frowned. Joseph continued, "I used to be a businessman. Wealthy, proud, and angry. My wife died of cancer when she was only 38. We had 2 kids. I buried myself in work, ignored them, destroyed every relationship I had. I was heading toward the same cliff you were on last night." Daniel listened intently, drawn to the softness in Joseph's voice. "One night, I walked into this very church. It was snowing. I was drunk. I don't even remember why I came in. But a priest was here, lighting candles. He didn't preach. He didn't ask questions. He handed me a bowl of soup and said, 'Sit. Rest. God is near.'" Joseph chuckled. "I didn't believe him. Not then. But I kept coming back. Something in this place, it kept calling me. Or maybe someone." Daniel stared into his tea, reflecting. "I used to believe," he said. "When I was younger. My parents, they were religious. Kind. Faithful. They believed God was in everything. And for a while, I did too." "What happened?" Joseph asked gently, though he already knew. "They died. Car accident. 3 years ago. I'm sorry. I prayed every night after that. For answers. For peace. For something. But there was nothing. Just silence." Joseph nodded slowly. "Sometimes, God is silent. But that doesn't mean he's absent." Daniel looked up, bitterness flashing in his eyes. "Then where was he when I needed him? When my parents screamed in that car? When I begged him to take away the pain?" Joseph didn't flinch. He had heard that question too many times. He had asked it himself. "He was there, Daniel. Even in that moment. But not to stop the pain, to walk with you through it. We live in a broken world. A world that breaks bones and hearts and dreams. But God doesn't cause the storm. He enters it." They sat in silence. After a while, Joseph picked up the small Bible he had offered the night before. "I want you to read something. Not a sermon. Not doctrine. Just a story. The story of Jesus' last day. His trial. His crucifixion." Daniel took the Bible reluctantly, flipping through its thin pages. The words felt foreign in his hands, but also familiar. Like a song he hadn't heard since childhood. "Why that part?" he asked. "Because it shows the deepest pain a man has ever faced. And the deepest love ever shown. I think you'll find pieces of yourself in his story." Daniel wasn't sure what he believed anymore. But he nodded. "I'll try." Over the next few days, Daniel stayed at the church. He had nowhere else to go, and Joseph didn't seem to mind. The old man gave him small tasks, sweeping the floors, helping with candles, sorting old books in the back room. It gave Daniel a strange sense of rhythm, of purpose. Each evening, after the last candle was blown out, he would return to the same pew, wrap himself in the same blanket, and read small portions from the Bible. He began at the Garden of Gethsemane. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He paused. That line hit him like a blow. It was exactly how he had felt on the bridge. He kept reading. He read about the betrayal, the unjust trial, the beatings. He felt anger rising inside him. This man did nothing wrong. Why was he being punished? And then the cross. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Daniel read that line 3 times. Forgive them? The people who mocked him? Who nailed him to a cross? Who watched him bleed and laughed? How? Daniel closed the Bible and sat still. The storm inside him had quieted, not completely, but enough for him to hear a whisper beneath the noise. That night, Daniel had a dream. He was walking in a vast desert, cracked earth beneath his feet, heat pressing down like a weight. The sky was dark, the horizon endless. In the distance, he saw a figure walking toward him, dressed in white, glowing. As the figure came closer, Daniel fell to his knees, overwhelmed by guilt, pain, and shame. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The man knelt in front of him, lifted his chin gently, and said, "I know." His voice was soft, but powerful, like thunder wrapped in silk. Daniel sobbed. "I'm broken." The man, Jesus, placed a hand over Daniel's chest. "I was broken too," he said. "But I rose. And you will too." Then everything turned to light. Daniel woke up with tears on his cheeks. He sat up, heart pounding, the dream still vivid in his mind. He looked around the church, the candles still flickering. He clutched the Bible to his chest, not out of habit, but out of a strange, stirring feeling. He wasn't alone. He never had been. The dream lingered in Daniel's mind long after he woke up. Even as the morning sun poured in through the stained glass windows of St. Peter's Chapel, painting rainbows on the wooden pews, he sat there motionless, heart pounding, breath shallow, trying to make sense of what he had experienced. He had dreamed of Jesus, not as an idea, not as a figure in a book, but as a living presence, walking through the desert of his soul. He remembered the heat, the weight of the silence, and how it lifted the moment Jesus knelt beside him. The hand on his chest still burned, not in pain, but with warmth, comfort, a strange sense of being seen completely and still accepted. He had woken up with tears drying on his face, not from sadness this time, but something deeper, a mixture of relief, awe, and surrender, as though something heavy had been lifted from his shoulders in the silence of that dream. That morning, he didn't tell Joseph what he saw. He couldn't. Not yet. The dream felt too sacred, too fresh, like a fragile seed not yet ready to face the wind. Instead, he helped clean the altar, polish the candle stands, and silently observed the gentle rhythm of the church. But something inside him had changed. The bitterness wasn't gone, but it had softened. The questions still lingered, but they no longer screamed. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something more than emptiness. He felt hunger, not for food, but for truth. That night, after dinner and quiet conversation, Joseph handed him a journal. Sometimes, he said, when the heart is full, the words need a place to land. Daniel held the old, leather-bound journal in his hands. It reminded him of his childhood, of scribbling stories in his room, of dreaming under the stars. He hadn't written anything real since his parents died. The idea of writing had become too painful, too close to who he once was. But now, he sat alone near the fireplace, the journal open in his lap, pen in hand. And slowly, hesitantly, he began to write. I don't know who I am anymore. I'm not the boy my parents raised. I'm not the man Grace loved. I'm not the writer I used to be. I'm just here, breathing, wondering. But last night, something happened. I saw him, not in the sky, not in a painting. I saw him in my desert, in the place I thought no one could ever reach. And he didn't turn away. He knelt beside me. He saw my mess and didn't flinch. He didn't demand perfection. He didn't lecture. He just touched my chest and said, "You will rise." I don't know what that means, but I want to. The pen stopped. Daniel's hand trembled. He placed the journal down and walked toward the altar. The church was dark now, lit only by the soft golden glow of a few candles. The cross at the center stood tall and silent, which shaped into suffering, but also into salvation. Daniel knelt. He hadn't done that in years. Not since the funeral. At first, the words wouldn't come. His throat tightened. His eyes welled up. And then he whispered, "Jesus, I'm sorry." It broke something inside him. Tears poured down his face. I hated you. I blamed you. I cursed you. He fell forward, forehead resting on the cold wooden floor. But you didn't leave. A sob escaped his lips. You were there, weren't you? He felt it, not a voice, not a vision. Just a presence. A holy silence that didn't judge, didn't demand. A silence that held him. For hours, he stayed there, pouring out years of grief. The rage, the regret, the longing, the guilt. Every word felt like a release. Every tear, a cleansing. When he finally rose, the church looked the same, but he didn't. He wasn't healed. He wasn't whole. But he had begun. That night marked something he would later describe in his journal as the quiet beginning of resurrection. The next morning, Joseph noticed the change. Not in Daniel's words, but in his eyes. There was light again. Faint, but present. Daniel told him about the dream. About the desert. About the touch. About the words. Joseph smiled. He's calling you, Daniel. Always has been. You're just starting to hear it now. They talked for hours about God, about pain, about forgiveness. Daniel confessed that he didn't feel worthy, that he had cursed God, that he had ruined everything. Joseph looked at him and said gently, Jesus didn't come for the worthy. He came for the lost, for the broken, for the ones who know they need saving. That day, Daniel read more from the Gospels, not as a skeptic, not as a critic, but as someone searching. He read how Jesus healed the leper, not from a distance, but by touching him. He read how he sat with outcasts, spoke to the unloved, wept with the grieving. He read about Peter, who denied Jesus and still was chosen to lead. He began to see the pattern. Jesus didn't choose the clean. He cleaned the chosen. That night, Daniel prayed again. This time, not to demand answers, but to give thanks. He thanked Jesus for the dream, for the silence, For the church. For Joseph. He asked not for a miracle, but for strength. Strength to let go. Strength to change. Strength to follow. And when he closed his eyes, he didn't see darkness. He saw the desert again. Only now, he wasn't alone. This was the night Daniel later called his second birthday. The night he didn't just encounter Jesus in a dream, but in his soul. The morning after his emotional night at the altar, Daniel stepped outside the church just as the sun was rising. For the first time in what felt like years, he noticed the warmth on his skin and the colors in the sky. The clouds had lifted. The rain had passed. It was just another morning in the city, people rushing to work, buses growling down the streets, pigeons fluttering from the sidewalks. But to Daniel, it felt like stepping into a new world. He stood there in silence, breathing in the crisp air, and whispered, "Thank you." 2 simple words, but they meant everything. Joseph joined him on the steps, carrying 2 cups of tea. They sat in silence, side by side, watching the city come alive. "You look different," Joseph said softly. "I feel different," Daniel replied. "Not fixed, not finished, but free." Joseph nodded. "Freedom begins when the chains we don't even know we wear finally break." Daniel looked at the church behind him. "I want to change. I want to live again. But I don't know how." "That's the best place to start," Joseph smiled. "Knowing you don't have the answers makes you ready to listen." That day, Daniel began what would become the most important chapter of his life, not the return to a job or to society, but the return to himself. He cleaned his apartment for real this time, not just pushing things aside, but removing everything that tied him to his past pain. Empty bottles, broken pictures, journals he couldn't bear to open. He cried as he did it. Every item was a memory, but he threw them away not out of anger, but out of surrender. He found his Bible, dusty and hidden in a drawer. He placed it on his desk, next to Joseph's journal. Every morning, he began with prayer, not long or poetic ones, just simple conversations. "God, help me stay clean today. Jesus, be near when I feel weak. Thank you for waking me up." The battle with addiction didn't vanish overnight. The urges still came, especially at night when loneliness settled in like a fog. But Daniel was no longer fighting alone. When the craving hit, he would write. When the memories overwhelmed him, he would pray. When he felt like giving in, he would go to the church. Joseph had introduced him to a small Bible study group for men and 2 women, each carrying their own scars. One had lost a child. Another had survived cancer. One was an ex-convict. But all had one thing in common. They had met Jesus in the wreckage. They welcomed Daniel like family. They didn't flinch when he told his story. They didn't judge when he admitted his failures. They simply said, "You're not alone." One day, after sharing his testimony with the group, a young woman named Lila approached him. "You know," she said, "when you talk about pain, there's something healing in your voice. Like your words carry light through the cracks." Daniel chuckled, a little embarrassed. "I'm just telling the truth. That's why it works," she smiled. That night, Daniel wrote in his journal, "Maybe my pain wasn't a waste. Maybe the fire I walked through was meant to warm someone else. Maybe Jesus didn't rescue me to hide my story, but to share it." Joseph continued to mentor him. They read scripture together, discussed forgiveness, and talked about calling. "God doesn't just heal you," Joseph once said. "He gives you purpose through your healing." Daniel had been thinking about that word, purpose. One afternoon, he walked past a youth center downtown. He saw a group of teenage boys fighting outside. 2 volunteers were trying to break it up. One boy, barely 16, had rage in his eyes that Daniel recognized. He saw himself. That night, Daniel went back to the center and asked to speak to the manager. Her name was Clarissa, a stern but kind woman who had been working with at-risk youth for over a decade. "I don't have a degree in counseling," Daniel said, "but I know what it's like to be broken. I know what it's like to think your life is over." She looked him in the eye. "Have you found hope?" "I found Jesus," he said simply. She nodded. "Then you can help more than any degree ever could." A week later, Daniel started volunteering first once a week, then 3 times, then full-time. He led writing workshops for teens who had trouble expressing themselves. He shared his story at recovery meetings. He sat beside boys in court hearings. He prayed with them, cried with them, believed in them. One night, after leading a small group session, a boy named Trev asked him, "Why do you care?" Daniel looked him in the eyes. "Because I've been where you are, and someone cared enough to sit with me in my mess. I want to do the same for you." Trev nodded. "You think God really cares about people like me?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Especially people like you." Months passed, then a year, and slowly, The city began to know Daniel not as the drunk writer who vanished, but as the man who had come back with a purpose. He wasn't perfect. He still had bad days, nights when grief knocked on the door, moments when temptation whispered. But now, he knew where to turn. He knew who to turn to. One evening, he stood at the front of St. Peter's Chapel during a special service. Joseph had asked him to share a message. The church was filled, not just with believers, but with people who had once walked dark roads. Daniel stepped up, holding his journal in one hand, a worn Bible in the other. He looked at the crowd and said, "I'm not a preacher. I'm not a saint. I'm just a man who met Jesus at the bottom of my pit." He paused, and he didn't pull me out with a rope. He came down into the pit with me and walked me out, step by step. There comes a point in the healing journey when the past stops being a wound and starts becoming a testimony. Daniel had reached that point, not because all his pain had vanished, but because the pain no longer controlled him. It was no longer his prison. It had become his platform. It had been nearly 2 years since that rainy night he wandered into St. Peter's Chapel. 2 years since he almost gave up. 2 years since he whispered his first fragile prayer in the dark. Now, his life looked different in every way. He had a small but neat apartment near the youth center where he volunteered full-time. The walls were no longer blank and empty, but decorated with artwork from the teens he mentored. On one shelf sat a row of journals, each filled with his handwritten thoughts, prayers, stories, and lessons. And right at the center of it all, his old Bible, dog-eared and underlined, a witness to every tear and breakthrough. His days were busy now, but in a different way. He wasn't rushing to escape himself or filling time to avoid his thoughts. He was pouring out love, purpose, redemption. In the early mornings, he'd prepare lesson plans or devotionals. In the afternoons, he ran group sessions at the center. And in the evenings, he'd spend time with the kids who needed extra help, those who stayed behind when everyone else left. He had become something he never thought he'd be again. Useful, needed, trusted. But it wasn't just about the service. Daniel had also begun to experience something he never expected again. Joy. It started small, like the way it felt to hear laughter in a room he used to cry in, or the taste of coffee shared with a teen who once hated him. It grew when he helped reunite a runaway boy with his mother, or when a girl who had been trafficked stood in front of the group and said, "I matter now." Daniel smiled more, laughed more. He even wrote again, real stories, fictional tales filled with hope and courage, stories where the hero didn't start strong but learned to rise. He was even invited to speak at schools, churches, and community centers, not as an expert, but as a survivor, as someone who could say, "I've been there, and I came back." One evening, after a long day at the center, Daniel sat by the river, the same one he had almost jumped into years ago. The water still rushed by, fast and wild, but it no longer called to him in the same way. Instead of despair, he felt reflection. He pulled out his journal and wrote, "I used to see this river as an ending. Now I see it as a reminder. A place where death was once an option, but where life was chosen. Not because I was strong, but because Jesus stepped in when I had nothing left. He didn't just save my life. He gave it back to me new." One of the most beautiful parts of Daniel's transformation was the restoration of his relationships. Grace, now married and a mother, reached out to him after hearing his testimony online. "I saw you speak at that church in Houston," she said during a video call. "I couldn't believe it was you." He had smiled. "I couldn't believe it either." They spoke as old friends, without bitterness, without regret. She told him she had prayed for him every night after she left. He told her he finally understood why she had to go. "Thank you for leaving," he said. "Because if you hadn't, I never would have hit rock bottom, and I never would have found the rock beneath it." Daniel also reconnected with old friends, those who had once tried to help but were pushed away. They welcomed him back with open arms, amazed by the man he had become. A few of them even began attending his Bible studies. His story was spreading not because of marketing or platforms, but because hope has a way of traveling on its own. People came to the youth center asking, "Is this where Daniel works? The guy who talks about Jesus and second chances." He never said no. One particular night changed everything. Daniel had been invited to speak at a citywide gathering for recovering addicts. Hundreds filled the hall, some clean, some still struggling, many just searching. He stood on the stage, holding nothing but a mic and a Bible. The lights were hot, the crowd quiet. "I'm not here to impress you," he began. "I'm here because I almost didn't make it. I stood on a bridge, ready to give up. I had lost my parents. I lost the love of my life. I lost my job. I drowned my pain in bottles. I hated God. I hated myself. A few heads nodded. But one night, I walked into a church, and I met a man named Joseph who gave me tea and a Bible. And I met Jesus, not the distant God I blamed, but the Savior who walked into my desert and knelt beside me. He paused, his voice steady, calm. Jesus didn't rescue me from pain. He rescued me through it. He didn't erase my past. He redeemed it. And if he could do that for me, he can do it for you. The hall erupted in applause. Tears streamed down many faces. After the event, people lined up just to talk, to hug, to say, "You gave me hope." Daniel smiled each time and said, "That was him. I'm just the echo." Back at St. Peter's Chapel, Joseph watched Daniel grow into a leader. The old caretaker began stepping back, letting Daniel organize services, lead prayer meetings, and even preach on Sundays. "I'm getting old," Joseph chuckled one day. "And you, my friend, are the new shepherd of this place." Daniel's eyes widened. "Me? I'm not a pastor." "You're a man who knows what grace feels like," Joseph replied. "That's better than any title." Years had passed since Daniel first walked into St. Peter's Chapel, soaked by rain and nearly broken beyond repair. Time had healed many things, but more than that, time had revealed who Daniel truly was. Not the man who gave up, but the man who was lifted up. Joseph had retired quietly, leaving the care of the chapel to Daniel, not with formality or ceremony, but with a quiet conversation over tea in the back room. "You've carried the flame well, son," Joseph had said. "Now it's your time to tend the light." Daniel accepted with humility, tears in his eyes. He remembered the night Joseph found him trembling by the fire, lost and unsure if he even deserved to be alive. He had been met with warmth, not judgment, with kindness instead of questions. And now, he was the one carrying that same spirit for others. The chapel was more alive now than ever before. The benches were filled on Sunday mornings, not with polished saints, but with people who had walked through storms: addicts, ex-convicts, single mothers, lost youth. Daniel preached simply, but truthfully. He didn't lecture. He told stories. Stories of Jesus. Stories of redemption. Stories of hope that rises from ashes. He became known as the pastor who listens. People came to confess, not just sins, but hurts, loneliness, doubt, and Daniel welcomed every one of them. He would sit for hours with people who just needed a space to cry, a place to breathe, a place to believe again. One stormy night, something unexpected happened. Daniel was in the back of the church, lighting the last few candles for the evening prayer service. Rain thudded against the windows, thunder echoing in the distance. The church was mostly empty, save for a few regulars praying silently in the pews. Then he saw him, a boy, no more than 16, standing at the doorway. He was soaked from head to toe, his hair stuck to his forehead, clothes clinging to his thin frame. His eyes held the same look Daniel once saw in the mirror, lost, broken, searching. Without a word, the boy stepped inside. Water dripped from his sleeves as he shuffled forward and sat in the very last pew. Daniel didn't rush over. He finished lighting the candles, gave the boy a moment to breathe, and then walked slowly toward him, stopping a few feet away. "You okay?" he asked gently. The boy didn't respond. He just looked ahead, eyes fixed on the flickering flame at the altar. Daniel waited. After a while, the boy whispered, "I didn't know where else to go." Daniel nodded. "I didn't either, once." The boy glanced at him, curious. Daniel smiled and sat beside him. "Do you want something warm to drink?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. Minutes later, they sat together in the church kitchen, holding mugs of hot cocoa. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. "My name's Daniel," he finally said. "What's yours?" "Ethan," the boy replied softly. Daniel leaned back, watching the steam rise from his cup. "Ethan, can I tell you a story?" The boy shrugged, but didn't say no. And so Daniel began to speak. He told Ethan about the boy he used to be, the one who believed in stories, who lost everything, who ended up on a bridge ready to jump. He spoke of the rain, the pain, the night he wandered into this very church, thinking it was just for shelter, not knowing it was holy ground. He spoke of Joseph, the tea, the Bible, the crucified Savior who whispered, "You are not alone." He shared the dream, the desert, the hand on his chest. He didn't dress it up. He didn't hide the ugly parts. Ethan listened quietly, eyes wide, heart cracking open. When Daniel finished, the room was still. The storm outside had softened into a drizzle. "You're the pastor here?" Ethan asked. Daniel smiled. I'm the caretaker, the one who tends the fire, lights the candles, and tells the story. Ethan looked down. Do you think Jesus would even want to hear from someone like me? Daniel didn't hesitate. I think he's been waiting. That night, Daniel gave Ethan a blanket and a place to rest on the very same pew he had once slept on. Before leaving him to sleep, he left a note beside him with just 4 words. You're not alone anymore. The next morning, Ethan asked for a Bible. By the end of the week, he was helping Daniel sweep the church floors. Months passed. Ethan became a part of the church family, quiet at first, unsure, but slowly blooming. He started attending youth group meetings, asking questions, playing guitar during worship. His story wasn't simple. His family life was complicated. His pain ran deep. But he was healing. One evening, Daniel sat with him by the river. Ethan looked at the water and said, Sometimes I still feel like I could fall back into the dark. Daniel nodded. That feeling doesn't mean you're failing. It just means you need to hold tighter. To what? Ethan asked. To Jesus, Daniel said. To the story he's writing in you. Years passed. Ethan grew. He finished high school. He became a youth counselor. He spoke at schools, led worship nights, and began mentoring other kids who reminded him of himself. One Sunday, Daniel watched Ethan speak at the pulpit for the first time. My name is Ethan, he began, and this church saved my life. Actually, Jesus did, but he used this place to find me. Daniel sat in the back, tears in his eyes, a proud smile on his face. Joseph, now living in a quiet town upstate, wrote Daniel a letter. You've done well, my friend. The fire still burns. Keep lighting the way for those walking in darkness. That's what shepherds do. Daniel never stopped writing. He filled journal after journal with thoughts, prayers, and dreams. His first book, The Desert and the Hand, became a local bestseller, a memoir of pain, encounter, and transformation. But he always said the real story wasn't in pages. It was in people, in Ethan, in Trev, in every soul who found their way into the chapel. He had lived through the storm, met Jesus in the desert, and now his life had come full circle, not back to who he was, but forward to who he was always meant to be. And whenever someone lost would ask him, Why do you care? He would smile and reply, Because someone once cared enough to sit with me in my storm. And that changed everything. Then he'd open the door, light the candle, and say, Come in. Let me tell you a story.